Good day, chess world. So we have our continuation of this Capablanca endgame series. This is endgame 16. And this one is an interesting one. This has a little bit of a mystery because if we'll look at this game actually ends in reality on move 38. But many chess manuals, chess manuscripts back in the day record the game going on much longer, 10 more moves, which is actually just not true. What happened was Teichmann simply cracked under the pressure that he was continually under and resigned, many people think prematurely. But a lot of the analysis which is provided out there as game history is actually just Capablanca recording and saying, this is how I would have won. So we're going to jump into a lot of those fun themes about this game and talk about pressure, talk about the inability to defend a difficult position, how we can defend and how we can put pressure on. So this is going to be a nice little bit of a mystery, but let's first jump into some of the wonderful lessons that we're going to be focused on in this game. First and foremost, from this game, I hope continually you're picking up from the different lessons, but centralize your king. When we talk of queens being off the board, the king becomes an active fighting piece. You've got to find a role. And you want your king in the center. Why? Number one, because if your king is there, their king can't be there. Number two is your king can dictate what side of the board it wants to go. Very important. From the center, it can go to whatever side. And that was very important in this win we're going to see from Capablanca. Then we get plan number 2 in the end game. Use your pass pawns. And this is going to be the big one. Use them. Not necessarily just push them. You cannot just indiscriminately run the pawns up the board. We're going to see in this one where Capablanca actually, his opponent resigns before he technically creates the pass pawn. And then we're going to look at this idea of Capablanca's rule for bishop endings, which is opposite color pawns. Put your pawns on the opposite color to your bishop. If you have a bishop endgame, put your pawns on the opposite color of your bishop. And we're going to unpack why, what we're going to be looking to do in this one. Now, this one's a little bit more difficult because generally you want to put your pawns on the opposite color of your bishop so that you increase the range of your bishop and take away potential opportunities for the opponent. But what increases the difficulty of this endgame we're going to look at is bishop of opposite color, which have a massive amount of drawing problems, drawing tendencies. Finally, and don't worry, we're going to unpack why they have those drawing tendencies. We'll get into that when we get into this later bit of a theme, and I'll expand. Stick around, and we'll look. Then finally, don't just randomly give up material in the end game. In the opening middle game, activity is very valuable. Activity makes a big difference. But in the situation when we talk of end games, you've worked so hard for your material. And we're going to see Teichmann, he just doesn't want to defend. He doesn't want to be in passive position and makes a mistake of just giving up material almost indiscriminately, thinking that it increases his activity. Now, certainly in a rook and pawn endgame, activity matters. Yes, maybe there we can think about giving up pawns. Watch in the later part of the series a spectacular game from Capablanca in a rook ending against Tartakova. But this one, as we'll see, is a minor piece one. It's not that big a deal. But Teichmann wants to use this theme of bishop to color to hold a potential draw in these cases. Okay, I keep going on and touching on this bishop's a color situation, bishop's a color. What does it mean with the bishop opposite color endgame? Let me help unpack a little bit of, shall we say, a little bit of statistics to help you understand what are you aiming for when you have extra material in the endgame. So let's take a look at this wonderful graph. Now, this is a wonderful graph from back in the day, a great in-game little bit of a manual, and it's pretty accurate in this case, even for today's statistics. And what we're talking about in this graph is if you have an extra pawn and you trade down into different end games, out of most games, where do they end up in a result? So if you have an extra pawn, what end game do you want to aim for? Obviously, we start with number one. If you've got an extra pawn, you want a king and pawn endgame, no pieces present. Very rarely do you get a draw from king and pawn endgames where you have 5 pawns versus 4 or 3 versus 2. Most of the time, the extra pawn is going to make its weight felt. But in the opposite end of the scale, in bishop opposite color endgames, you could be a pawn, 2 pawns up, have 5 versus 3, and in many cases, they still end in a draw because of the struggle to control squares of the opposite color. So that is a nice little tool. Also, rook versus rook endings are infamous for how challenging they are to convert. If you just go back and look at the last endgame Capablanca played against Duras, he had 4 versus 3, and technically it's supposed to be a book draw, but of course, when we're looking at Capablanca, no such thing as anything as a book draw. So in this one, we're going to look at and get an understanding a little bit of bishops of color and some of those themes. But let's get into our chess position for this one. So here we have, this is our wonderful endgame 16. Queens have just been traded off. Capablanca's knight has just taken from c3 to e2. And here what we have is very interesting because it's a quick transition in this endgame, and we're going to see black makes a substantial mistake. Let's first evaluate. Who do we think is better or worse? What do we think is going on? Just stop here and take a moment, because this is really going to help your evaluation skills, really going to help you to make your judgment. Because if we look at some elements here, technically we are in a late middle game, early end game. Remember in my previous videos, I've touched on the 5 phases of chess. And this is a great example in this one, where we're talking about the different patterns that exist of evaluating a position. And what we're talking about here, this is in that transition phase from a middle game to a end game, because we have, well, 3 minor pieces each, plus a rook. So I want you to think a little bit. Black is now going to make their move. Black decides to play this move of rook to c8. And let's talk of the evaluation. Who do we think is better or worse? Well, first and foremost, take a good look and just understand that, well, white is better. And why do we say that? First and foremost, we look at those kings, king safety, king position. Neither king is weak. Neither king is in trouble. That's not a factor in this one. And neither king is active and fighting, because we talk about when we look at the king, how safe and where is the king. Then the next element we look at is that material distribution. And this is a big one. Who's up, who's down, who's got what? And we have this battle of black having the bishop pair versus white having the knight and the bishop in this contest. And right now, this is supposed to be the superstar bishop for black, but it's a bad bishop because it's boxed in by his own center pawn. It's limited, which is a big deal. We're also, stick this in your memory banks, this is an isolated queen's pawn, and that square is a magnificent outpost square for a knight, for a white knight. Why? By the very nature of it being isolated means there's no pawn to come along and chase it away. So a brilliant square for us to understand here. Then we talk of, okay, so we can see material distribution. It's slightly actually in black's favor because this bishop is so poor. And then we get to the big one, pawn structure. Who's got what we would call the center open or closed? Well, it's kind of semi-open, and we can see that that pressure on this is a big deal. Weak pawns, weak squares. This pawn is weak. This square is weak. This one is weak. There's a whole collection of weak squares. Not so much in white's camp. Capablanca's done a brilliant job. He's been super efficient with moving his pawns. So there's not many weaknesses in this case. And finally, we talk of piece placement. Well, yes, this bishop, not good. This knight is the best minor piece on the board. So all of this ties together where we can clearly see white has that little advantage, the better chances. Plus, they have pressure that they can generate in this situation. So in this one, how do we take ourselves forward? Well, of course, those knights. The knights need outposts. So we go immediately with knight f5. Very, very good in this position. So now black does a good job. He brings his king to f8. And just like that, Capablanca makes the bishop pair disappear. Gone. There is no advantage of the bishop pair. We'll cover that later in some of the endings. But generally in the endgame, the bishop pair is a real tangible advantage. But I do want you to see what Capablanca's done. He's now, his worst placed piece was this knight on when it was e2. It was the piece doing the least. And now what he's ended up doing is technically traded the e2 knight for that bishop. So he's grown his position a little bit. Now, it might seem such a small factor that this bishop is limited, but it's a big deal. Plus the fact that this pawn is here. So black now has a problem. They would love to invade with this rook on the file, but there's no invasion square. The knight covers it. What a job the knight is doing. So here, as I was raising, when we looked earlier, black needs to focus on stubborn, simple defense. And the basic point for black is to focus and improve their worst placed piece. So it's very difficult to follow on this one, but black now plays this very poor move of pawn to g6. Really not good. And this is where the modern look and the old analysis changes, because Chernev in his book puts down and says that this is practically forced. Well, I can say, Mr. Chernev, no, it's practically lost. Why that is of course because look at these hideous holes that he creates. As it was, that was the only pawn that he had, that black had, fighting for a dark square. This is a very poor decision to do this. So we can see this transition now, heading towards a pure endgame, is handled very badly by Teichmann. He's really not handling things well. His position is difficult, yes, but if he were to play, let's say, a move like rook c5, improving his worst place piece, since if knight check, now he can play, yes, he is worse off, but as we shall see, he is at least contesting this game. When he plays g6 now he is stuck in a awful pin. So his pieces are tied down. And just bear this in mind, in the endgame, one of our big goals is to tie down the opponent, to limit that opponent. And that's what we've got in this case here. I mean, wow, that king is stuck, their knight can't move, and now our knight is doing a brilliant job. So now we need to turn around and say, okay, what are we looking to do to grow our position? They've just played g6. How do we look to continue in this one? Well, after g6, we get this decision where he says, in the simplest of terms, I need to improve my worst place piece. And what is that? That's the king. So how does he do it? Well, we would think that maybe king f1 is the move, but he plays a nice move, f3. Very good move. Why? Because he wants to get his king in with the potential it could run the side. Also, he would like to go across. But already he wants to take control of the center because he can see, look, I don't want my opponent's knight to get in. And now Teichmann is really struggling, and he must break out of this pin. He's in a bad, bad way. This is not a good position here. Because if we just talk of threats, white wants to push their pawns on that king side and really gain space there. So now he plays h6. We would not describe this as completely careless, as maybe necessary because he has to get out the pin. The pin is completely paralyzing him. So bishop takes h6. Now he plays his knight back to d7. So Capablanca already now starts forming this plan. Plan number 2 in the endgame. Use your pass pawns. He plays h4. And what he's doing is he's creating this future threat that, hey, I want to play g4, h5. That's an outside pass pawn. And he's getting that weight to count in this position. So the opponent plays knight to c5, then he drops his bishop back to f4, because we should be careful. Don't unnecessarily rush the pawns. So he plays bishop back, and then Teichmann has got a clear plan. Remember that graph I showed you? Teichmann thinks, no, I'm going to get to bishop opposite color, because if I get to a pure bishop of opposite color endgame, I can hold this draw. And as we'll discover, it's not so simple. So knight e6, knight captures. We're happy to trade. We're in a good position. There is a possibility we keep the knight on, but Capablanca says, no, I'm fine with this. Now he plays rook d2, a nice preventative measure because the opponent's rook would like to invade. He takes that away. His opponent now plays rook to h8. Okay, what are we going to do in this position? How do we handle this? The opponent's threatening our pawn. What is our plan of action, shall we say? Well, there are still rooks present, so we need to make our rooks the most active piece we can. That's very important. When the rooks are on the board, you want them as active as possible. So here, it's fascinating where he does this little tactical trick. He plays rook to c2. Now, to many players, this would look like a blunder. What am I doing? I mean, I'm giving up this pawn. But we see how bad this bishop is, how limited it is, because now after the rook invades, suddenly, wow, this is just a terrible situation. The bishop has no move, has to go back. And suddenly, such a simple, convincing situation, rook a7. Immediately, Capablanca's won material, but with interest. He's won it back. The bishop has to come here. Rook takes. Look how active that rook is. So in this one, Teichmann decides, no, I will play rook c8. Should we trade? Should we trade off? Well, actually here, we don't really have much choice. Capablanca, if he didn't want to trade, should have played it a bit differently earlier. But Capablanca still believes, hey, I'm a pawn up. I'm going to be able to convert this endgame. Bishop takes. Okay, now what should we do? Again, it's valuable for us to see on this theme. Yes, we're a pawn up. But I hope by doing this series of endgames, when you're done with all the 60, you will arm yourself with different tabias, as we call in chess, different positions, chunks to remember in your head. Hey, I remember seeing this strategy. Can I use that? That's going to arm you against your opponents of how to apply yourself, how to grow your positions and decisions. And we have now exactly this moment. How do we apply ourselves? Well, we have to centralize the king. Remember plan number one in the endgame. Attack the opponent's weak pawns. There would be a temptation for so many chess players to play g4. Let me make the pass pawn. And here, I do want to highlight to you, there's so often this fake news. Fight against the fake news. It doesn't exist. Push your pass pawns. No, you could be pushing them to their death. That is not correct. That's why I want you to remember the terminology. Use them. You're smart. You must decide what is the best way to use the pass pawns. So here, the move, of course, is king f2. We're going to send our king in, and I do want you to see the problem of an isolated queen's pawn right through the game. Any isolated pawn, that square directly in front of us is a wonderful square. Look at the problems of these weak, dark squares that they have no control on whatsoever. Now let's unpack. Why is g4 not great? Well, in the simplest terms, he's going to push f5. And now suddenly we start seeing the problems that emerge. g5. And look how all the pawns start getting stuck on dark squares, and he can't gain control of the light squares. Capablanca's rule for bishop ending still applies. You would like to put the pawns on the opposite color of your bishop. Here, it's to gain control of the light squares. But we should not rush. We shouldn't make targets. So king f2, pawn to d4. What? What is our opponent doing? And this was what I raised in the introduction. Teichmann needs to just batten down the hatches and defend. But it's quite fascinating because even Chernev says that this is an unstoppable path to victory of the king coming around. But it's not true. He can hold. It's difficult. It's going to be difficult. But he can hold in this position where he can make life very, very difficult for his opponent. So he can make it a real challenge. And here, I think this is actually just a draw. Why? Bishop b1, push the pawns around. If we notice, he's trying to build a light squared blockade in dominance. So black's goal is different in this bishop opposite color ending. Notice what black is doing. Black, as the defending side, would like to put all their pawns on light squares so their bishop can defend it. And now it makes it rather clear for them. f5, building this fortress. If the king joins in over here, king to e6, I want you to see the fortress that has been built. There's no pawn to win here because this pawn is going to go to a4. Very, very important. So now we can add to things a little bit. In bishop of same color endings, Capablanca's rule applies to everyone. Put your pawns on the opposite color of your bishop. Grow the strength of your bishop. In bishop of opposite color endings, if you are the side that's pushing for the win, and remember, you've got to do what the position demands. If you're the one like this with Capablanca, you need to put your pawns on the opposite color of your bishop to control those squares. So Capablanca would love to have his pawns on light squares. If he could have played b3, pawn to a4, that would be wonderful. Why? Because then he can fix this pawn here and win it. But instead, that doesn't exist. So to get this win is very challenging, and to apply pressure, very difficult. By the way, I think you could pick up on just that little moment there. why one of the key moves for Capablanca would be to put the bishop here, stop this pawn running forward. That would be one of the key ideas. But still, it's a much better defense. Instead here, Teichmann, no, he plays d4, gives up his weak pawn. Pawns still matter. So Capablanca says, now I'm 2 pawns up. So now the king runs to d5. Of course, we defend, bishop to e6. What is our plan of action? What do you think we're going to do in this situation? Because we're 2 pawns up. What's the process? How do we convert? And I hope from this game, you can look, learn, add this into your arsenal of ideas. How do you convert when you are up material? Well, remember, we want to use our pass pawns. So the purpose is to tie down the opponent, then distract them somewhere else. We've got that already set up for us because this pawn is sitting here and they're looking to blockade and build this blockade. So Capablanca does a nice little theme here. He says, look, I still want to have a future plan of attacking this pawn. Also, I do not want to see my opponent invade. So first and foremost, he does a preventative measure. He plays king to d3. The point being that now when the enemy king moves, he plays a3. Now, I also just want to highlight that b3 is 100% fine, and he could have done this, following that principle, gaining control of the light squares. But instead, he chose a3 because he already had the win plan that we're about to see. Bishop c4 check. Where should our king go to? What is our choices? Well, Capablanca keeps it rather simple. He wants to utilize his wonderful pawns. So he plays king to e3. We still have to be careful, and I just want to highlight the danger of bishop to color. If you play king c3, you put things at risk because suddenly the bishop moves, you push g4, the bishop moves, and now it's a little bit tricky in this case. As we'll see, this doesn't throw away the win. Same win will occur that we have in the game, but Capablanca doesn't want any of these complications. So what he does is the opponent plays bishop e6, and I keep alluding to this win. And in the simplest of fashion, what does he want to do? He wants to create this outside pass pawn. Now, this pawn is a big, big deal, because if we generate the outside pass pawn, the opponent can only stop us on 2 different squares. We can see because of our control, he cannot stop us on h5. We're going to go g4, h5. Then he's going to capture, and then he wants to build a blockade on this. So Capablanca brilliantly says, no, I'm going to take that away from you. I'm going to prevent this. So I want you to think now, take your time. It's important conversion. We have our plan. We would like to go g4, h5, use our passports, but we need to solve this problem that when we go g4, h5, captures, they have the chance to play bishop f5 and build a blockade of the square. So the key is move the bishop. Capablanca decides he's going to play bishop to h6, and this is a great theme again. This is not a case of where if you chose to play g4 first or you chose to go bishop g5, that it's wrong. No. You have the right plan, and you don't have to necessarily execute with the exact same moves. The key is the right plan and the right strategy, and that's the beauty of endgames. That's also what I want you to see from Capablanca. Having a strategy is more important than just playing moves, than just trying to be perfectly accurate. Now, there are many positions where, yes, you do need to be accurate, but if you have that idea, that right plan, famously in chess we say, bad plan's better than no plan, but let's preferably make a good plan. So bishop h6, the opponent plays king d5, and then he plays bishop g7, and we get such a striking moment in chess, because this is where the game ends. Teichmann resigned. He resigned, which is fascinating, because there are actually a lot of historical books that recorded it that no, the game went on longer. In this case, the game continued, because they were so surprised about this result. Let's talk about the plan. The plan from Capablanca is he wants to put the king here, g4, h5, and then there's no chance on stopping that pawn. So let's say the opponent plays bishop f5. Then Capablanca's analysis is king f4, threatening to play pawn to h5, little tactical trick, which works wonderfully well. So the opponent then would play bishop d3, and now we can see the plan, which is, of course, we want to stop the bishop from interfering. So king g5 is what Capablanca said, go for this weak pawn. The opponent plays king e6, g4, bishop drops into c2. How do you think we continue in this case? Again, there's a couple of winning plans, a couple of winning ideas. The key is just finding a good one. And this is also, by the way, exactly how Capablanca played his chess. He didn't want to force himself into positions that required precision. He wanted to play positions that simply required good decisions. So in this case, yes, you can play pawn h5, 100%. But Capablanca put in his analysis this move of f4, the point being that after bishop d3, check, captures, check, bishop takes, and then d5 check. Bye-bye, bishop. And the bishop has to fall. If the opponent did not capture, in this case, look how he uses the pawns. If the opponent ran with the king away, we have built a wall, and suddenly that pawn has a free run into the end zone, collecting victory in this case here. Absolutely brilliant. So this is absolutely brilliant in this case of how Capablanca wants to win it. I want you to see that center. Notice how Capablanca's king earlier was sitting on the other side of the board, that king side, then went to the center, then back to the king side. Black's king has not had that access, not been able to use the center. So what a wonderful work that we have. And if we just highlight some of those key moments, I think first of all, Teichmann's transition is very poor. This rook c8 and all that was fine. Yes, he is in a worse position. Stick this one in your memory banks. Clip it out. Put it in your mind. Remember this theme of using that outpost square for the knight and how effective it was. Also something that we'll cover later on, the danger of the bishop here, how he fought against it, this move knight f5. There's no choice. The bishop can't go out of the way because knight d6, so he has to give back the bishop pair in this situation. And that's part of the challenge that he's confronted with. So he does play the best move of king f8, but then there's just this terrible move of g6. And be careful pushing pawns. Teichmann teaches us in this case here, remember pawns can't go backwards. And those dark squares were always a problem in that further case. And then I think with his changes, his trades, he got himself into a mess. He gives up a pawn here on h6 where the bishop falls. And then without doubt, don't just give up material for activity. And this is a valuable lesson. If rooks are on the board, as we'll discover, yes, active rooks are so valuable, so very important. In a rook ending is the only time you should consider giving up material for activity. But this move of pawn to d4, very poor move. And we can understand because he wants to activate his king. He thought, I have an active king, I'm doing well. No. Then he's dead lost. Had he tried to just stay and defend in a very difficult position, that was his best shot. But d4 just handed the win to Capablanca, and Capablanca executed perfectly, using that center pawn as a distraction, tying the opponent down, and then generating the outside pass pawn threat. Notice, as I said to you, his opponent, shockingly, incredibly, resigned after this bishop arrived on g7. He has not even yet created the pass pawn, but it's the threat of it that his opponent could not find a resistance to, and he just threw in the towel. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Please put down what moments you found most instructive in this one. What did you learn? Put in some analysis. Any queries or questions, drop them in. And join me in the next one, where we have Capablanca playing a consultation game and cashing in against some of those collection of masters that he was playing, actually.